What's up everyone, thanks for watching. My name is Dave and today my son's going to be making us a couple of woodworking marking knives. He's been wanting to get into bladesmithing and metalworking and I thought this would be a real cool project to get started with. We're going to be using 16-inch thick 01 tool steel for this project because it's real strong, easy to heat treat, and inexpensive. We started by drawing a pattern out on some graph paper and then cutting it out with a carving knife. Then he places the pattern on the steel to mark out the length. Now he can clamp the metal in a vise and use a hacksaw to cut it to its rough length. We should be able to get one full-length knife blank and two blades out of this one small section of steel. Next, back at the workbench, my son's going to color in the knife blank with a black Sharpie. Then he applies a little bit of trim adhesive to the back of the template, puts it on the knife blank, and uses a scratch awl to mark out the shape of the knife. Then he can take the blank back over to the vise, clamp it up, and use a hacksaw to cut out the rough shape. Next he can head over to the belt sander and start refining the shape of the knife. Since this was Joey's first time at the belt sander, we started with a 120 grit belt. Now this way he could get a feel for the sander and how much material it was going to take off. Once he was comfortable with it, we'd switched it out to an 80 grit paper so he can get a lot more material off. Making sure to stop as the metal got hot and let it cool off before continuing. These are going to be spear point marking knives, so he's grinding two angles so that the points come together at 60 degrees. This is pretty common for most of the high-end marking knives that we researched. And we figured this was a good starting point. The great part about making your own tools are you can experiment with different angles and stuff and try different things. So once he finished up at the belt sander, then it was back to the vise and he got to try his hand at filing. He's using a hand file here to make sure he's got all the lines of the knife nice and straight. He'll work the sides down flat, checking them with a straight edge every now and again. Once he can't see light between the straight edge and the side of the knife, he'll know he's flat enough. For the marking knife that's going to have the metal going all the way through the handle, Joey's marking out with a center punch the location of the two brass pins that'll help hold the handle together. Then he can take the blank over to the drill press and drill out the two holes for the pins. The bevels on the blades are going to be roughly 30 degrees, so to make those we're making a simple jig at the table saw. It's just a block of wood that we cut at 30 degrees, and then we can clamp the knife to it, take it over to the belt sander, and grind that 30-degree bevel into each side of the spear point. This was just a down and dirty jig that we made up real fast, but it ended up working out pretty well. Now he was ready to harden the steel. To do this we needed to get the blade to about 1450 degrees or an orange color or just above a non-magnetic state. So we first tried heating it up with one propane torch and that wouldn't get it hard enough, so then we tried two propane torches. And when two didn't work, then we had to make a little makeshift forge out of some fire bricks and stick both propane torches in there to get the blade to that real bright orange color that we needed. Then after a few minutes of heating up in our little forge, we were able to check it to make sure it was demagnetized and then quench it in some peanut oil. After we were done quenching, we were able to check the hardness of the steel by trying to run a file over top of it. The file wouldn't cut the steel and it kind of bounced right over it or skipped over top of it, so we knew we were in good shape. Then we took the blade over to the bench and clamped it down and sanded off all the scale that we created during the hardening process. After we were done cleaning up the blade, it was time to anneal it. We anneal it because we got it rock hard, and now we need to soften it up a little bit down to a Rockwell hardness of around 60. And do that by sticking it in the oven at 400 degrees for about an hour. This will soften the steel enough to allow us to sharpen it, but make it hard enough still to keep a good edge when we're using it. After annealing the steel, it comes out of the oven in like a straw color or maybe a light gold color, so we're just sanding that off at the bench. The next step is to take the knife over to sharpening stones and get a flat back on it and sharpen the two edges. I'll be honest, these are not easy to sharpen. Spear point marking knives are probably one of the toughest things I sharpen, and my son wanted to tackle it head on. So he started off on the 1000 grit stone, flattening the back and then working on the bevels. and once he got them sharpened, he went to 4,000 grit stone and repeated all the process. There was no jig or anything for this. He had to do it all freehand, which was even more impressive. I was really proud of him for this. He finished the sharpening by taking it over to the 8,000 grit stone, repeating all the same processes, flattening the back and working the edges until he got it nice and razor sharp. Then he brought it over to the strop, ran it across the charged leather a few times until he got a mirror finish on it. Now he's ready to start working on the handle. The handle's going to be made out of a piece of walnut that we had laying around, so first he's cutting it to its rough length at the bandsaw. Since the handle wood is going to sandwich the blade, he's ripping the walnut down the middle to get 2 halves. So after resawing the handle blank over at the bandsaw, he'll clean up both sides using a hand plane. This is Joey's first time using a hand plane, and it took him a few minutes to get the feel for it, but once he did, he was killing it, no problems at all. Next we headed back over to the bench vise to hacksaw off a couple of brass pins that'll go into the handle. Then we took the knife and the handle blanks over to the drill press and drilled out the walnut where the pins are going to go. We drilled one hole and then stuck a brass pin in it through the knife and the handle so that we could position the second hole properly. Because shaping this part of the handle is going to be hard to do after everything's all glued up, he's taken a file and a rasp and just rounding over the edges that are going to be closest to the blade tip. Then he'll just clean everything up with a little bit of 150 grit sandpaper. And now he's ready to start mixing up some 5-minute epoxy and glue on the handles and put in the brass pins. I don't know what happened here, but I guess I didn't record this part or I deleted it by accident, so I apologize for that. But we just applied some glue to everything and clamped it all up. We let it sit overnight, and the next morning we were able to remove all the clamps, and everything looked pretty good. So the first thing to do after taking it out of the clamps was to hacksaw off the excess brass pins. He did that over at the workbench, and then afterwards was able to take it over to the belt sander and start shaping the handle. He roughed in the shape of the handle using 80 grit belt over at the belt sander. He sanded it all the way down until he had metal showing on the sides and on the back. And then he was able to flip it over onto each face and sand them down until they were well proportioned, and there was an equal amount taken off of each side. After finishing up over at the belt sander, he took the knife over to the bench and hand sanded with 150 grit paper to round over all the corners. Then he took some 220 grit paper and refined the whole knife. And then he took it for a quick test drive just to make sure that it scribed a good crisp line. Then after that I couldn't resist, so I had to give it a couple of tries. The next step on this knife was to apply a couple of coats of boiled linseed oil to the walnut. The second marking knife he made was more like the traditional marking knives that you purchase at a store. It had a small blade with a tang sticking out that gets inserted into the blank. This is the first time Joey's ever got to use a wood lathe, and I thought he did pretty good. He roughed a piece of cherry down from square state all the way down to the round cylinder. We went online and picked out a design that he liked, and then he just got to play around with the lathe and tools for a while until he came up with something that looked pleasing to his eye. This marking knife is going to use a brass ferrule. That's going to keep the wood from splitting apart when we install the tang and the blade. And then we also cut a kerf into the end of the handle so that will accept the flat part of the blade. And this way when we install the ferrule around it and epoxy everything in, it'll just give it some added strength. So after applying some epoxy, all that's left is to stick the knife blade into the handle, make sure that we got the kerf or the blade sitting into the kerf, and clean up all the excess epoxy. And the last step on this knife is to also add a couple of coats of boiled linseed oil to that cherry handle. And that's it for this project. I got 2 brand new marking knives that my son made me. They work great. The walnut handled one is heavy enough and thin enough to where you can wield it like a pencil, but it leaves a good crisp line. I had a blast in the shop teaching my son these new skills. He had a lot of fun making these things. I got a feeling we're going to be making some knives and different things in the future. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and please consider subscribing, and I will see you guys in the next one.